Good afternoon. I want to spend a little time this afternoon talking with you about food security, and particularly food security in a rapidly changing world that is facing a number of challenges. And so when we begin to talk about food security, probably the first thing we need to do is get a definition out of the way. What do we mean when we say food security? It comes down to a very basic question. Can we reliably feed a given population? Do we have the food necessary to provide for that population to thrive and survive? Underneath this umbrella question, there are three smaller questions we must ask. The first is regarding the question of availability. Is that food simply available? Can we get our hands on the food that we need in order to provide it for that population? The second question is that of physical and economic access. Can we get that food to a place where the people in need of it will be able to get it? Are they able to get there? How much travel is involved? What are the hurdles that they'll have to go through in order to receive that food? We think of this particularly when we think of like the United States, talk about the lack of grocery stores in our urban city neighborhoods, particularly our poor neighborhoods. These stores just aren't available, and the poor people there just cannot have access to the food that they need. The other question is economic access. If the food is available, can they afford it? Is it priced in such a way that it is within their budget? And if they can afford it, are there systems in place to help with that? Are there food stamps available? Are there food pantries? Or are there government assistance? Some way that this food will be made economically available to the individuals. And finally, we think about utilization. Will they be able to use the food when they get it? Will they recognize it as food when they see it? Is it something that they're used to eating? Will they know how to prepare it when they get it? Will they have the means to prepare it and the supplies necessary to prepare it? These are all questions that must be asked and dealt with if we're going to talk about food security. Lately, we've been adding a fourth aspect to that question, or fourth question to this, and that is the question of sustainability. Which basically boils down to, can we continue to keep doing this to provide the food that they need? Is it something that we can do long term and continue to do on an ongoing basis? Or are we doing it in such a way that we're degrading the environment around them? And so we start asking questions like, can we produce safe, healthy, and accessible products? Can we, in the process, support a viable community and an economy? Or are we doing this to the detriment of the community and the economy? Can we create livelihoods and safe working conditions for those involved in supplying the food? Can we operate within the biological, ecological limits of our natural resources? Are we taking and asking more from the earth than it can give? Can we do it in such a way that we can reduce our ecological footprint by reducing energy use and resource input? And it gets back to staying within the limits of the natural resources. And can we do it in such a way that maintains high standards for animal health and welfare? Or are we doing this at a detriment to another life form? So these are all questions that we have to look at if we want to think about the sustainability and the long-term effects of how it is we go about providing food for our people. As I noted at the outset, there are many threats to to food security. Those threats are coming from a wide variety of sources and a wide variety of places. One of the most dramatic is in population growth. The population of the world is growing rapidly. Up till now, we have been able to keep up with population growth and our ability to generate enough food to feed them. The problem hasn't been in food production; it's been in food distribution and the willingness to do that. But we're getting to a point where the population growth is beginning to outstrip our ability to do that. What we're seeing is the population is increasing faster than our increase in productivity in agriculture. And so the ability of agriculture is not going to keep pace with with the growth of population that we are experiencing in the world today. And this, of course, is going to lead to a serious challenge. Another factor affecting food security is the increased demand for meat due to a rising per capita income. Now, a rising per capita income in and of itself is a good thing. We want to see the people of the world thrive and survive and make more money and have a higher standard of living. But one of the things that we've noticed is with a higher standard of living comes an increased demand for meat. And so what we see is more and more resource sources are being diverted into the production of meat rather than the production of grains for food. And we know that the amount of food that goes into creating meat is not the same amount of energy that we get back out of that meat. And so it's a net loss. We're actually having to raise more food to feed the meat than we're getting back in food value from that meat. And so this is a diversion of land that we could be using to raise crops to support people, but instead it's going to raise animals. Another factor is the increased demand for biofuels. Again, from the outside, this looks like a pretty positive thing. We know we're running out of fossil fuels and our oil supplies are limited, and so we're starting to find ways around that, and we're starting to raise like corn, for example, for biofuels, and adding that into the diesel fuel and the heating oil supply. And that's a good thing, other than here again, it's diverting cropland away from the production of food and into the production of biofuels. And so what we see is more and more land being devoted to the production of biofuels and not devoted to the generation of food. And so this is a concern. We also see land being diverted to raise export products. Rather than raising food to supply the needs of the local population, what we find is farmers are investing in a more lucrative trade of raising commodity crops, those crops that will be shipped around the world and generally have a higher dollar value, market value than foods sold on the local market. And so we run into this strange situation where in some parts of the world we have farmers who are raising crops and doing very well doing so, but they are exclusive for export and are being shipped out of their country, and we see people in their own country starving for lack of food. Because here again, local lands are being diverted into this export market rather than for the production of local food. Another big factor affecting food security will be climate change. This is something that we have talked about in this class at great length. Many of us, even before the class, were aware of many of the effects and the threats posed by climate change. But we may not stop to think about the effects that has on agriculture. Particularly, we think about the changes in temperature and the changes in rainfall events, precipitation events. And so when we look at temperatures, we know that the increase in temperatures are having a negative effects on agricultural crops. We know that in some areas wheat production is already down by 40% due to climate change because of the increase in temperatures and the added heat stress that is being placed upon the plants. And so we're already seeing these effects. Changes in precipitation go to both extremes. We've seen areas where crops have been destroyed by flooding, by massive amounts of rain in very short periods of time. We've seen areas where crops have been destroyed by drought, just a lack of rain. And so it goes into both extremes with these changes in precipitation. And both of these, the increase in temperature and the change in the nature of precipitation, both of these are playing into a decrease in cultivable fields that are able to be cultivated. The amount of land that we can devote to agriculture. And so this is a significant concern also. We were really worried about this. Another area that we worry about is our current agricultural practices. There are several things that we do in modern agriculture that are going to have long-term consequences for our ability to feed ourselves. The first is monocropping. We tend to raise a very limited number of crops now, particularly in what we call big agriculture. We raise only those crops that return the best dollar yield, and so usually those here again are commodity crops, crops that we're looking to export to other countries, and we concentrate on those. And so what we see is a whole lot of soybeans and a whole lot of wheat being raised, and not a lot of diversity. And several things happens that when that happens. Number one, when you monocrop, you are growing the same crops again and again and again in the same field, and it tends to deplete a certain set of nutrients from that field. And when it does that, it is destroying the soil on which it's grown. You're not able, if you're only growing a couple crops, you're not able to effectively rotate crops to replenish those nutrients, and so this has a negative effect on the soil conditions. We also tend to raise, and particularly in this country, raise crops that are weak-rooted annual plants. They do a terrible job of returning nutrients back to the soil, and once they are harvested, their weak root system has very little effect at trying to hold the soil in place, and what we see is soil being lost to wind and to wind erosion and to significant rain events. Another factor affecting food security in terms of agriculture is what we're just doing to our soil in general. We have an increased reliance on synthetic fertilizers. And what you find with this is all of these things are all kind of tied together. So this goes back to monocropping again. Because we are planting the same crops over and over again, there is no crop rotation. What we need to do is to then make use of heavy amounts of fertilizer. In fact, some scientists have said, particularly in the Midwest in the United States, the soil is so depleted that it is basically a sponge, and the only way that we can grow anything on it is to soak it in fertilizer and then plant the crops in that fertilizer. And so we find modern agriculture extremely dependent upon synthetic fertilizers. These synthetic fertilizers are made out of petroleum. They are becoming increasingly expensive as petroleum products become rarer and rarer, and here again they're also adding to the depletion of our resources. There's a limited supply of fossil fuels, and our increased use of fossil fuels for manufacturing these synthetic fertilizers is increasing the rate at which we're running out of those. Also, as the temperatures warm and as rain events change, we have begun to rely more heavily on irrigation. And irrigation, while it is a short-term solution, has negative long-term consequences. Number one, irrigation tends to deplete the aquifers in which it is occurring. What we find are farmers having to drill deeper and deeper wells to find water, and as they continue to do so, they continue to drain the aquifers even more, and they are rapidly running out of water, not only for their farms, but for their households and for their communities. The other problem with irrigation is it also changes the soil chemistry. When the water evaporates, it has a tendency to leave behind salts and minerals like aluminum that change the chemistry of the soil and make it uninhabitable for life, which is sadly ironic, in that here in the process of irrigating our lands to raise crops, we are making our lands unable to sustain those crops. And also, when we irrigate, that water does not evaporate, runs off, and when it does, it takes with it these synthetic fertilizers, the pesticides that we're using to control the insects on these crops, and it washes them all into our watershed, our streams, our rivers, our lakes, and ultimately into our ocean. and this is changing dramatically the chemistry and the makeup of our lakes and our oceans and our rivers. We see this in terms of the large algae blooms that have been reported on the news recently, increasing dead zones in some areas of lakes and rivers. And a lot of this has to do with agricultural runoff from these fields, particularly ones that are irrigated. And the final threat to food security we want to look at is long supply chains. Now, first we have to think about what a supply chain is in terms of agriculture. And when economists talk about supply chains in agriculture, they look at 4 different types of chains. The first is the local chain, and this is where food that is grown is locally consumed, or relatively locally consumed, within a couple hundred miles of where it is raised. Most of it is sold fresh with little or no preservatives and little or no preparation. It is taken out of the fields and it is marketed direct to the consumer. The second supply chain is a conserved supply chain. Now this supply chain goes back in history, just like the local chain does, goes back in history a ways. We have a long history of finding ways of preserving our food. Traditionally we did it through smoking, drying, and salting of various types of food. Some foods were pickled in order to make them last. Lately, we've come up with some newer processes. Now we have started canning things. We pasteurize it to take out the bacteria so that it lasts longer. We freeze it, which is a fairly recent development in preserving foods. We have these ways of preserving foods, and now this food, a lot of it can be conserved or can be consumed locally, or this conservation allows it to be shipped longer distances and allows it to be moved around the world more effectively. The third supply chain is a manufactured chain. This is just what it sounds like, where these foods are taken in and they are made into something else. And so we think this requires not only the food source, but also then the injection of other ingredients into it, whether it be other food sources, spices, chemicals, all kinds of things go into manufactured foods. And so you think about things like Kraft macaroni and cheese dinners, frozen pizzas, banquet chicken nuggets, just all of the various foods that are available to us today. Many of them are actually manufactured foods. They have been processed in some way. And then the fourth supply chain is the commodity chain, and these things are foods that are traded in bulk, that are shipped overseas, generally on ships, and are shipped long distances. When we think of this chain, we think of things like rice, grain, soybeans, corn, wheat, beans, sugar, even concentrated orange juice. Things that we ship in bulk to be processed in another part of the world and consumed in another part of the world. And so those are the four kinds of supply chains that make up, if you will, agribusiness, for lack of a better term. And what we're particularly concerned with in terms of food security are the long supply chains, sometimes referred to as long-distance food chains. And we primarily see this happening in the last 3 of those 4 types of supply chains, in the conserved, the manufactured, and the commodity chains. And what we see is that there's a limited number of industries that are involved in the production of these foods and in the selling of these foods. So in your commodity chain, in your manufactured chain, and in your conservation chains, what we're finding is that there is just a limited number of corporations, multinational corporations, that are becoming dominant in controlling the buying of and then the manufacturing, shipping, and conserving of food as it gets moved around the world. And this consolidation in the fewer hands is very concerning. Economists are beginning to worry about what happens if one of those corporations fails, and what happens when there's just a few limited players that control the vast majority of the food in the world. We see this as a growing trend all over the world. It is not just in the United States, it is all over the world. The amount of food that was shipped in the world grew from 200 tons in 1961 to over 800 tons by the year 2000. An incredible increase in food in just a span of 40 years, the amount of food that we move around the world. Our food in the United States typically travels anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 miles before it reaches us. The vast majority of the food that we consume is not grown locally. It is grown all over the United States, it is grown all over the world, and it is shipped to us. The food that we produce here locally in the area where I live, the vast majority of it is shipped to other parts of the world. So as we've noted, what we see is an increased dependence on a limited number of non-regional suppliers for food. And like I said, this is very concerning for a lot of economists and for a lot of people in the ag business, beginning to really worry about this. Because what happens then when we have political instability in a region where one of these businesses is located? What do we do then about providing food? When we have certain areas of the world are providing the majority of crops, what do we do when there's a regional crop failure in that area? If there's a drought, in South America, what does that do to the food supply chain here in the United States? If we have a drought in the Midwest, what does that do for the food supply chain in China? And so this becomes a serious question. Also, these long supply chains depend heavily on transportation. We rely on transportation to get the vast majority of our food. As I said, it's coming from thousands of miles away for the most part. Disturbingly enough, most major cities in the United States maintain less than a 2 days supply of food that is available to them. Less than 2 days. If transportation were to stop tomorrow, the vast majority of major cities in the United States within 2 days would be seriously facing a serious shortage of food. It's amazing to think about. Transportation also adds cost to the price of food. Right now, these costs are being subsidized by low fuel cost. There's some government subsidies in place that help prop up the shipping of food. And so we're not feeling the full effect of cost at the moment, but with the rising fuel prices and an uncertain economic future, we don't know what the long-term consequences of that will be. There's also threats, as I said, to just the timely shipping of food in many different forms. Extreme weather events, natural disasters, again, political instability in areas. All of these things can affect our ability to move the food around the world, and we rely so heavily now on our ability to do that. That's why these long supply chains are so concerning to so many people. It takes the control out of local hands and places it into the hands of a few corporations, and places it at the mercy of weather, at foreign regimes. It places it at the mercy of economic forces. There's a lot of things that play into the instability of these long supply chains. And one other thing it does, interestingly enough, is it also breaks the waste cycle. In traditional farming, when waste was generated, it was put back on the fields again. In these long supply chains, the food waste that is generated is far from areas where it was produced. And so we've kind of broken this cycle of providing nutrients for our soil by relocating the waste to where it goes. So now that I've completely brought you down and made you worry about where your next meal is coming from, I want to give you a little glimmer of hope, and that little glimmer of hope is the rise of local food production, is the rise of the return to the local food economy. And this is the hope This is the hope of food security in the future. And so how does this work? So what are the benefits of a local food economy versus a long food economy? Well, by very nature, a local food economy breaks the long supply chain. It severs that chain in several spots and keeps the food local. In a local supply chain, food only travels a couple hundred miles rather than thousands of miles to reach us. Local supply chains tend to be more diverse in their ownership. It is not controlled by multinational corporations. It's controlled by individuals and smaller companies. And so you don't have this concentration of power like you do in the long supply chain. Local supply chains also tend to plant a greater diversity of crops, thereby eliminating a lot of the negative effects of monocropping. We get back to being able to rotate crops again. We get back to being able to pick crops that are best suited for an area, or be able to adjust crops as weather patterns change. If the early crops didn't do so well, we might be able to substitute a later crop that we can sneak in the growing season that we have left. And so there's this greater diversity of crops that makes the local supply chain a little more environmentally and agriculturally friendly. Local supply chain also tends to use more sustainable agricultural practices. They tend to not rely quite as heavily on synthetic fertilizers, to rely as heavily on pesticides. In some cases, they go full-on organic and eschew the use of chemicals entirely. And this helps to rebuild the soil. On these smaller farms, what we find is the farmers are more connected to their soil, and so they tend to take better care of that soil. Local food production also benefits the local economy. The local food dollars stay local rather than my food dollar as it is now. When I buy a frozen pizza, that food dollar is going to a multinational corporation someplace in the world. When I buy my vegetables at a local food stand, that dollar stays local and helps that farmer, helps that local business stay in business. And then as they buy tractor parts and they buy seed and they buy fuel in this area, that helps the local economy, and all of those dollars continue to provide for the needs of the people in this area. What we also find in a local food economy is the quality of the food is improved. The food is fresher. There are fewer preservatives involved. There is less risk of contamination. We see stories and recalls upon recalls upon recalls where food is being recalled from all over the United States because it has been contaminated at a processing facility. With less processing facilities, there's less risk of contamination. And when there is a contamination, it will affect a far smaller area than it does currently. There's also the benefit of improved flavor. So many of the foods that we eat today are bred for shippability and not necessarily for flavor. They are more concerned with the fact that your tomato can survive a 2,000-mile trip to get to your grocery store than they are as to what the flavor of that tomato is. And so what we find is locally grown fruit, we can go back to concentrating on flavor and grow those varieties that maybe don't ship so well, but taste better. An added benefit to local food economies is there's less packaging involved. One of the things that we have seen with the growth of the long food chains is because of the increased shipping that is involved, the increased processing that is involved, there is a lot more packaging that is involved. By some estimates, 1/3 of all waste going into landfill is not only wasted food, but it is the packaging that food came in. And what we find with local food economies is because it is not being shipped long distances, less packaging is required, and so we can eliminate that from our waste stream. We also find is that it reduces the carbon footprint. By not shipping the food products all over the world, we reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are needed for the planes, the trains, the trucks, and the ships. And so this changes dramatically the amount of carbon that is being released in the production of food. Not having to ship it makes a huge difference. And so local food economies seem to be the hope for providing food security. Getting food production back in the hands of local individuals and back into the hands of the local economy seems to make great sense. So what is the danger of not attending to this? What's the danger of conducting business as usual? We have food on our tables. We're able to get the food that we want. In fact, we have a wide variety of food in our stores. We can buy different foods from all over the world. So, but what is the threat in this? The consequences of not dealing with food security are very extreme and very dire. If we get into a situation where because of the long supply chains, because of what we have done to the earth through our agricultural practices, we are not able to feed our people. Obviously, we face the threat of famine and starvation, of just not being able to provide enough food for the number of people that we have here on earth. And so the threat of famine and starvation is very real. When that happens, what we see is the mass migration of people. People will go to where there is food or where they believe food to be. And so you will see increased mass migrations of people. As people are not able to provide for themselves and create sustainable practices to raise their own food, we're going to find this. And so we have to think about what that means. Because once we have these mass migrations of people taking place, what we have seen and what we will continue to see and what will grow is civil unrest. Just the number of people that will be flocking into areas will cause nations to have to figure out how to deal with this. We're seeing that now in places around the world, particularly in Europe with the Syrian refugees. And we see the effects of that, the civil unrest that is resulting, the change in the attitudes of governments and of people, the protests, the violence against foreigners. All of this will be a very real threat if we don't deal with the threat posed by food security, or should we say food insecurity. But local foods seem to be the answer. Place the control of food back in the hands of the local people. Raise those crops that are most suited to those people and to that land, that are most adaptable to the changing climate, so that the nations can feed themselves. I thank you for your time. You have a great day.